gather, and I'd like to ask you, Muhammad, that
not a gentleman, and second, that he didn't regard us as any man at all. So now clearly we have to be about the business of finding more effective methods to raise the questions and to get the questions properly answered.
What would you do, Muhammad, in terms of for the benefit of white churches, kind of thing that you've been doing all along, daily, almost? How would you state the case for reparations? And
there are a couple of things and a couple of ways to look at the whole question of reparations. One is clearly in terms of the politics and the economics of the thing, where we can look at the whole development of the great corporate capitalism in America, the whole industrial revolution, the whole super technological society that we have now, and see that the capital that was accumulated for that process, for that development, largely came through slavery. That America would not be the wealthy country it is today if it were not for the resources of black people, the free labor of black people. And that since slavery, the process has continued, and that second-class citizenship and job discrimination, that these are just manifestations of kind of an updated slavery, a new style slavery to meet new economic and social conditions. Looking at that, we see a whole case for the sense of debt, the idea of debt. Moreover, we can look at historical and political precedents. What happened in Germany and what happened subsequent to the fall of Nazi Germany was that the case for reparations was made for the Jews on two bases. One being the economic base, that is, the fascist government had expropriated land holdings of individual Jews, property holdings of individual Jews, but that it was a collective act aimed at Jewish people as a whole. The moral part of the argument, although it was never stated in the legal case, the real moral force behind the argument for Jewish reparations was the fact that the Germans had indeed, practiced such barbarity against the Jews. The 6 million in the ovens, was a case that nobody could ignore. The parallels for black people are, of course, the stolen labor, the free labor. In fact, the stolen people, literally, physically stolen from one place and transported to another. And of course, the series of barbarities, practiced against our people have meant for us that we have always lived in a fascist nation. We have not experienced just a 5 or 6 year period of fascism, but we have experienced a history in this country that's been a history of 40 million people killed, 40 million black people killed before getting to America on the slave ships between 1810 and 1850. The countless lynchings, the countless acts of wanton police brutality. What happened in North Philadelphia not long ago when a mentally retarded child was shot down by a policeman, a 15-year-old kid. That for us, this has been the course of events, and that there are precedents and parallels to the argument. That's one whole thing. Without getting too tedious and recognizing that most of us here have some experience in the church and can probably speak to this better than I, there is, for Christians especially, for people coming out of the Judeo-Christian experience, there is a theological basis which has to do with what we call the 3 R's of repentance, reparations or restitution, and reconciliation. That what has happened has been that crimes have been committed, sins have been committed. There is a blood debt, and that, as it says, making scriptural reference, as it says in the Bible, if you've sinned against somebody, if you have a debt, that it's not enough just to mild repentance, but that the tree is known by its fruits, and that in order to make the repentance real, that there has to be some concrete act of repayment of setting things straight, and that this is, an action that must be, a prelude to a full and complete reconciliation, man to man and brother to brother and brothers together to God. So for people coming from a theological basis, there's more than enough in the scripture to explain and justify and prescribe the justice of the whole business of reparations.
But I think I have found that too often people would like to jump to the resurrection and the victory without going through the struggle. By that I mean, in a meeting of our council of the diocese a few months ago, one of my fellow priests seemed disturbed by some of my expressions and my feelings and tried to assure me that he was my brother. And then he asked me, aren't we brothers? And I'm sure it was a painful thing for him to hear me say, no, we are not. And I feel that if he really wants to enter into a relationship of brotherhood, he must first recognize the injustice and the damage which has been done to me, and that there must be an acknowledgement of this, and something must be done to repair that damage which has been done before we can arrive at a relationship which is really called brotherhood.
Yeah, I think this is tremendously important, because I think the history of the church in America has been one where there is, in a sense, been cheap grace. We have always been concerned about confessing our sins, but we've never really pushed this whole business of doing something physical to repay or make restitution for what we've done wrong. There are very few church services today, for example, that don't include a period where you confess your weaknesses and your faults and the injustices that you have committed. But yet very few services really emphasize this need to make outward signs of your concern and your repentance. We had, in an earlier discussion, had talked about the fact that in the gathering together for the Lord's Supper, we're always inviting people to the table, those who truly repent and are sorry for their sins and all of that. But even at that rate, to come to the table isn't enough, because we haven't encouraged the going out first to make straight what we've done wrong and then return to the table with having repaired some of this physical damage, so that we haven't really made the physical signs of the inward change. And we have never really encouraged this.
I'm just wondering, Carroll, brethren, it just seems to be so very obvious, so very clear, that it's very difficult for me to believe that there are really churchmen, black or white for that matter, who would even make an attempt to refute that. And hence, it's very difficult for me to believe that there are churchmen who sincerely refute the demand for reparations on any grounds other than the grounds of their own bias and their own prejudice. Perhaps politically they may say that there's no ground for the demand for reparations, but theologically, out of the framework of their own faith, it's just very difficult for me to understand why the Episcopalians had as much difficulty in South Bend as they had, why the Presbyterian Church, or the Methodist Church for that matter, would go through any great pains about it, about the acceptance of the guilt.
Vaughn, I think that a part of the problem is, again, this matter of making certain assumptions which have not been true. This has been called a democracy. It has been called a land of opportunity. It has been said that anybody who's got any gumption about him can make it in this great American form of life. And therefore, the assumption is that if I have not made it, it's because I am lazy, I am inferior, or there's something wrong with me. But it's right there for you. And these persons would refuse to acknowledge that there has been oppression, that there has been a denial of opportunities, that there has been a suppression of the rights of not only the black group as one of the American minorities, but all minority groups. And I think that this is where the hang-up is, the refusal to accept the fact that this has been an oppressive kind of a situation. And if people can once say that we have oppressed, we have denied, but even beyond that we have destroyed. Because, you know, as I think today of the whole thing about violence on the streets, people do not connect this violence with the other forms of violence and the violations of the dignity of man, the violation of our human rights, the violation of all of the other rights. And therefore, the violence on the streets is but an outward and visible expression of the other subtle forms of violence, and they're really not so subtle, but the other forms of violence which are not being talked about. And once people are willing to acknowledge this, then perhaps they can say, well, it seems as though this is a real case for reparations. We have indeed damaged, and repair must be made.
You mean to suggest then, you know, I believe that when Jim Foreman went to, spoke at a Sunday morning at St. George's Episcopal Church in New York City, I think, when a question and answer period at the end, or after the morning service, the rector of that church made the observation that if his people were told that their church was operating on funds that came from prostitution and gambling and a lot of illicit kinds of relationships having to do with sex and the obvious, or that had out of the puritanical tradition, or the obvious sins, that they would be repulsed, that they would be sick unto death even. But that if they were told, as they were that morning, that their funds, their operating money was coming from the banks that invest in the apartheid system of South Africa, and that their funds are derived from the cheated banana republics of Latin America and from the backs of black folk in this country who are exploited, and nobody even so much as raises an eyebrow.
And this is the violence that I'm talking about.
That's the kind of violence
Right.
that you're referring to. And I'm just wondering, if you gentlemen find that to be the case, and the reason for it, because it's just difficult for me, in spite of what Paul has said, that people will refuse to recognize their participation and complicity in the racist structure. But, for what reasons do they refuse to recognize it? I mean, they certainly can't be sound reasons in terms of their own theology and their own faith. I could very well accept that if we got A. James in our churches, that's, commonly referred to the person who sits back in the pew. Well, certainly in white churches, there's somebody comparable to that. That old sister who's been there for years sitting on that one pew, and perhaps she doesn't understand because she's waiting for the prophet to give her direction. But why is it that the prophet can't accept it? Why is it the prophet is unable to see or refuses to see?
The thing that I think either puts people off or is a convenient excuse is the mode, let's say, in which the Manifesto and Foreman and Muhammad and others make the confrontation. That is, to me, in terms of my own faith, in terms of my confidence in the Bible, the biblical picture of people like Amos coming into Bethel, into the church, into the cathedral of that little town, and pronouncing God's judgment on them for the hypocrisy of all their religious assemblies with injustice at their door, and how Amaziah, the head priest, didn't like it a bit and told Amos to get out of there. How Jesus finally, after a lot of conversation with the Pharisees and others of the religious establishment of that time, finally felt that it just wasn't getting through, and he went into the cathedral nation. I can't help but think, of a guy like Foreman coming into Riverside, or any of you going into any church, just exactly, as far as I can see, what Jesus did. And, of course, he got crucified for it. That is, people don't like to have judgment pronounced on them. And to me, one of the soundest, in terms of my own theological faith, one of the soundest aspects of the whole manifesto, regardless of its rhetoric, is the fact that, to me, there's a very modern parallel of a prophetic judgment. Now, the mode of it today, as with Amos and with Jesus, offends and irritates and makes the people, of course, who are being judged furious. because of the exposure and because they can't hide anymore. They're out there. And here is this thing that begins to unfold, all the exploitation and the injustice. So I think people react in fury at the mode of the confrontation and really then don't deal in their own minds with the justice of it.
Is it a conscious decision to react to the mode, or is that simply an excuse not to deal with the issue itself? Is it that the mode sort of sidetracks one's thinking momentarily, so that they're unconsciously they react to the blatant interruption of services? Or do they react to it consciously, knowing that the reason why they're reacting to that is because they don't want to deal with the issue?
I believe that people in that circumstance largely react unconsciously, which I believe that it takes quite a bit of soul searching and deep review of your beliefs and what you see in front of you before you're going to be willing to even begin to accept any guilt. Particularly, I think it's true when you get to someone who may have thought that he was your brother, Paul, and is suddenly surprised to find out that you don't think he is, and can't quite understand what he did, he himself as an individual. This distinction between an individual and in a society, I think, is part of the hang-up, and it isn't, I don't believe, in most cases, a conscious effort to first accept the guilt and then say, no, I better say that they used the wrong methods. I think you develop ways of dealing in society. One of them is the methods you're going to use, and one is the right, if you will, way to go about things. And I don't think that they've consciously accepted the guilt. That's where the problem is.
Well, doesn't this say something then about our whole church tradition and experience that we have over the whole history of this country? And, well, as they certainly have to rely on their heritage, but doesn't this begin to kind of point out how we've allowed people to grow? Most of these folks have spent their whole life in the church, and we have allowed them to grow old, never having to face themselves or what the Christian experience is all about.
And
They
Carroll,
don't understand what the Christian witness is.
and in
yet we
connection with
say
that, this
church
is why
people.
I feel that there is a real mission which falls upon us. I do not see that we can any longer allow people to live these lies, and I'm not going to accuse them of anything because people choose to accept an easy way out, or people do that. But for us to continue to cooperate with this kind of a life means that it comes to that point where we must assume responsibility for the condition itself. I can no longer myself be willing to go along with it and not call attention to the fallacies, not call attention to the lies, and expose it. And then once it is exposed, we have to try to deal with it. But I think that it has to be done.
The thing I think that is, a crucial thing to that is, and a thing that I think has gone largely unrecognized, is that the manifesto movement and the reparations movement says not only to the white community, but says to the black community, you have been a participant in a sin, to permit one's humanity to be denied without protesting, without being about the business of trying to reclaim one's humanity, one's manhood is sinful. I mean, again, the scripture says, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And if we as blacks are not about the business of actively loving ourselves and loving our own, then clearly we're lying when we profess to love white. So I think that, there's a whole redemptive thing in the manifesto in terms of black people too. But I think the failure, just as a question, I'd have to ask, if the failure of whites to recognize that aspect of the struggle, if the posture of being, we who are accused rather than we who are with potential brothers presented with an opportunity, to work our way to some just situation together. If that posture is not indeed indicative of the racism in the church that church leaders have, allowed to remain there.
I think one of the problems is, and it comes at this point, Muhammad, is that a great many of the people in the church were put off precisely because the judgment was directed against the church. Their image of themselves, the liberal leadership of the church, their image of themselves has been that of standing with their black brothers in opposition to this corrupt and racist system out here. For years, the churches have officially been on record and working with little programs here and there, a non-segregated church and a non-segregated society, identifying the racist history of the nation and favoring compensatory action, which is another word for reparations, on behalf of the nation, programs of government service and so on. But when Mr. Foreman stands up and says, "Thou art the man," when he lays the responsibility for the situation and the guilt at the door of the institution that has an image of itself as being in the forefront of the fight to eradicate racism and its manifestations from society, then that really shook a lot of people. They said, us, but we're on the right side. We're not racist. Look what we did. After the Civil War, we went down and established schools and freedmen's bureaus, and we've had this long history of service, medical, educational. We've supported all these liberal programs and so on. And then to hear the word of judgment. And I think this is one of the healthiest things about the whole thing, is that the word of judgment has been spoken to the church in the midst of this. But that comes as not only as a profound psychological shock to be told you are guilty, but also as a profound logical shock because of the image that so many good liberal white churchmen have had, that they and their institution were in the forefront of this battle. And so I think the fundamental struggle really is to establish this connection between the church as an institution and the racist system in which it has grown up. Many people simply refuse to understand that behind the official declarations and protestations of the church has been this long history of benefit, association with, and you could even use some stronger terms of relationship between that church and the system which it has implicitly blessed and which has made it a strong and vital part of this flawed American dream that Paul has talked about. And so I think the issue really does come back. Many people in the church are quite willing to face the justice of reparations so long as it's understood to refer to the racist society and its mistreatment in the past. But when it comes to the church, they say, no, we're on the other side, and they can't handle that.
Well, Dean, I think that something must again confront the church, and that is that the church has done much of its good, quote unquote, as charity, acts of charity. And as far as we're concerned, this is not charity. We're not concerned about charity. We are concerned about the fact that we have been damaged, and we want repair for the damage which has been done. And I know that this takes it into another ball field altogether. But
I think that's
sure
yeah.
is.
Go ahead,
I was
Don.
just going to say that in regard to that, one of the priests in the Episcopal Diocese refers to some of the things that are going on to help black people and other people as Band-Aid societies and Band-Aid groups. And I agree with what Dean said, and feel that it also is involved in the church trying to, over the years, be sure that it was separate from the state. It's the church is really set up, is sort of the way this goes. The church is really set up to take care of its own parish and to see that the people in that parish go to heaven and live good lives, or in the reverse order. That's what it is, and it's not really supposed to get involved in the social and economic problems of this country. Now, what the manifesto did, it not only said you're guilty and hoisted us right up on our Christian swords, because once we get through yelling about how it's Marxist and the preamble of the manifesto is Marxist and anti-Christian and anti-this and anti-that, we get down to the little, not the little seed, but the seeds of truth in the manifesto. We say, yeah, that's right. And but what does it mean? In order to take any action, we've got to get involved in the world.
Yeah.
And the church doesn't like that, really. They say they are involved in the world, but they aren't really.
I just,
I think-
I just wonder how it is that, or how is it, that there's so much difficulty with the church accepting the principle of reparations and beginning to act upon it, when nobody, in fact, has of any, that is of any note, and I haven't, and since the press has been pretty careful to blow up any kind of opposition, nobody's been taking issue with the legitimacy of the demand itself. That this trinity that exists in the country between church, business, and government is not really taken issue with. No one bothers to take issue with that. Hence, it would seem that the demand then is recognized as legitimate, that in conjunction with what Paul has just said, what the opposition is about is that we want to determine what we're going to do. Now, nobody's going to knock church charity, but that is implicit in the definition of church. But what we're talking about is repair for damages, which, one would say in biblical terms, this you ought to do and not to leave the other undone. Surely you're supposed to give. You're not supposed to stop giving because you're going to pay for a sin. You pay for a sin and continue to give. But another thing that we're dealing with is a matter of self-determination. Hence, the benevolent churches who have come around to saying, yes, the demand for reparations is just, and we're going to act upon it. We're going to raise several $100,000. But we're going to give it to our boys over here, and we're going to, the hell with the Black Economic Development Conference and all those fellas. They made a demand, but we don't want to deal with them. We're going to appoint our black people within our own communion, or we're going to pick one of these long-standing civil rights groups and give it to them. They are trusted friends. We know that they're going to. Well, you see, black people are saying that you're going to do it the way we say do it. We're the ones that have been hurt. When you're taking something out of my house, you can give me any number of things, but I want that thing back that you took. And I think that, perhaps Muhammad could speak to that in some more concrete terms, in terms of this whole quest for self-determination and the recognition of this trinity that exists in this country. And it's not a new trinity, in fact. It has always existed between church, business, and government, where although the rhetoric would say that we are separated, there's a separation between church and state, that the very persons who sit in the Congress and determine against, I believe, Thaddeus Stevens after the Civil War, that we're not going to give the 40 acres and a mule, were those who sat in the churches, sat on the boards, who sat on the trustee boards and the boards of managers and so forth, who comprised the session and so forth. Those very ones who made those racist kinds of laws and enforced them were good old Presbyterians and Episcopalians and good old Methodists and so forth. And so that there is an explicit relationship between the church, business, and government that I think has to be dealt with.
Mo, before you speak, there's just one thing that I want to point out, and that is that in good, Christian theology, it is not the offender which determines how the repentance will be acted out. God the offended, you have sinned against me, and I set forth the terms for your repentance and for atonement. And what black people are saying today is that we're not going to let white people tell us what they are going to do, but we are the offended, and we will set forth the terms or the conditions. Go ahead, Mo.
Yeah, this what you're just saying is, I think, just so very, very crucially important, because the experience of black people has been such to indicate very, very clearly that you can't let this man go and solve the problem himself. What has happened has been that, just politically what has happened has been that those movements in the country throughout history, led by whites, that said they would address themselves to the problems of blacks, have ended up leaving blacks stranded high and dry. That happened with the populist movement. That happened with some of our brothers and sisters who got caught up in the communist movement in the 30s, and found out that these people were white first and left second. A similar kind of thing, I think it's the same kind of thing that's gotten at theologically by the question of who decides how the offense is to be paid. I mean, accepting the fact of guilt, accepting the fact of participation in racism would clearly indicate that he who is most infected by racism is he who is least qualified to decide, what is the cure. Now, I think that part of the problem, though, for just the run-of-the-mill, the layman, the lay Christian, or just the guy who goes to the synagogue and isn't involved in setting the policies, setting the guidelines, that one of the things that has happened is that he has been sold short by his clergy, by his leaders. People in the church, are well aware. The leadership of the church is aware of where church monies are. But what happens? You have a case with the Methodist, for instance, where there are, our research shows, direct investment in napalm. But people in the church aren't told this. They are told that the Methodists don't have any money in tobacco, which again is true, but a little irrelevant at this stage of the game. That those liberals who you say feel particularly offended and particularly caught up tight because black people are saying to them, hey, you are the one, you are the man. Well, these are the guys who sit on top of the church structures. They're the guys who know what's been happening. In fact, they know better than the lay Christian where the monies are invested. They know better than the lay Christian what the real priorities are, So I think that not only are we talking about taking into account the institutions and the way that the institutions have functioned historically and function now, but that we have to particularly look at the responsibility upon the leaders of the church, especially the clergy, but white lay leaders too, who knew what was going down. How come you cats, let this thing go down like that? And I think that the reason for it gets back even to the point that was raised earlier about the opposition to the method. It's not what you say, but the way you have said it. And there are a number of things that we have to be conscious of. Black people in and out of the church are conscious of the fact that, number one, the manifesto movement never would have attracted the attention that it did if its language had been less direct. That's the first thing. And the second, the business, everybody was crazy about Abraham Lincoln because on his way to court one day, he stopped by the roadside and pulled a pig out of the mud and got himself all muddy. And everybody said, this is really great, the way he, inconvenienced himself to help this pig. Yet, white Christians permit themselves to equate the disruption of a Sunday morning service, to equate having a 2-hour dialogue session with what? With 400 years of suffering on the part of black people, with the fact that, millions of people, black, white, brown, in this country go to bed hungry, with the fact that, the priorities of the nation are such that it's easier to get money to kill and be killed in Vietnam than it is to run a Head Start program. I think that it gets back to racism, and particularly to the kind of irresponsible racism that's been practiced by the liberal leaders of the church.
Muhammad, I think it's as you say, it's horrible, and really a terrible indictment, I think, of the Christian church that as you say, we should be so upset by a little disorder in a church on a Sunday morning, but keep on smiling and saying things are great and everything's okay while our bombers drop napalm on Vietnamese people. That is, the blood and the carnage there and the injustice in our cities. For Christians on a Sunday morning to be more concerned about taste than truth is an awful reflection. I think that I was reminded earlier, Dean, when you were talking about the white liberal, of Dick Gregory's comment one time. He said, a liberal is a cat who will lynch you from a low branch. Indicating, you see, the thing that the Foreman Manifesto has done has unveiled the white liberal to himself. And I speak partly confessionally here because this has been something of my own experience. That is, people who, let's say, have fought for civil rights in voting and worked with people like Martin Luther King and, in other words, done what they thought they should do. Now to have to face the fact that all the time when we were talking about integration, we really meant black integration into white society, where I still run things. And the offense of the manifesto, part of it is, no, we want to run things or some things. And I think then the white liberal who feels he's been doing something, as he says, for the blacks, all these years, has to then discover that he's been paternalistic all along without realizing it. And that maybe he still wants to control what's done for blacks and whites. I think it's very hard for the white liberal to face it, that, as you were saying, Paul, he's willing to share a little charity, some crumbs, but not power.
I think that, when we've got to, there's some very concrete and specific things that have been demanded. And that is certainly recognition of the Black Economic Development Conference and payment of reparations to it. Now, that doesn't mean simply to it. That doesn't mean that you stop giving your contributions to other groups, as we said earlier. But there are some other folks, who are about the business of having to deal with this because of some direct confrontation or simply because they happen to be involved in this thing in some one way or the other. And I don't know, but I think it seems that the case is rather clear for most of us somehow or another. I don't know if we had some real serious questions about it, and it might be a real good time for perhaps, we don't want to make this a dramatic kind of thing, where you have black people just getting hot and splitting. But maybe we ought to just get off a bit and let some of the other folks who are here come in and the group of you can wrestle with this question, with the time remaining, and then maybe we'll come back and deal with it together. How's that? Let's go.
Let's try that.
All right. Okay. Cliff, while we're making some shifts here. You're associated with the Friends meeting in Chester, where there has been, as I understand it, a black group who has the building that you have has been turned over to them to put on a program. Can you tell us about that and your own feelings about it? What's happening?
Well, I think in the first place, I ought to point out that I am a member of that meeting, but I'm here as an individual, so I'd like to make that clear, and my views are my own. And in some cases, I certainly can relate the facts, which I would try to do. In fact, this group which approached, which took over, if you will, the building which had housed agencies working in the neighborhood, is not exactly a direct part, or claims not to be a direct part of the BEDC, although, of course, Muhammad was one of those who was in the initial confrontations and right through the whole thing. Basically, the group came and said you wanted an all-black board, which was true of one of these, one of the two agencies. Here we are. And we'll take over now, thank you, and just turn over and resign. And to the meeting, which at this point in time owns the building, but does not, and has membership on these boards, but they're not a direct part of the meeting. See, historically they're founded by the meeting, and then got on their own feet, became separate entities. To the meeting, this group said, also, we'd like to have the deed to the building, and also we'd like to have rather substantial funds to operate for the next couple of years. The meeting has been handling this really as a separate local incident. And I'd have to say that I don't believe that the meeting really feels that it has come to grips with reparations per se, but has looked at a specific individual incident which had its own long history and development to that point in time, and decided with a lot of soul searching this summer, and the meeting has really had a lot to go through. In the three organizations were involved, many people who, Dean, as you say, have been long-time, and Don, long-time liberal working people who have been doing things here or helping to do things which they felt were the way to improve the lot of their brothers, to find that some of their brothers were saying, no, that isn't the way, and we don't agree with you, and furthermore, we're not going to have it anymore, and you're going to just step aside, met with, naturally, a good deal of resistance and reluctance. And I would say that the meeting at this point has allowed the use of the building to this group and wishes them success, hopes that others will find their way clear to assist them in the programs which they want to put on, which incidentally aren't very much different than the programs that were being carried on, but under their own direction.
You know, Cliff, you've had to deal with something directly that I've often wondered how I would deal with if I were involved in, and that is the direct sort of give me something material. You know, not going through the normal, let me call it white man's procedures that we have for turning property over. I remember I was at a meeting once with, at which Muhammad Kenyatta was present, as a matter of fact, and Mattie Humphreys here in Philadelphia, a black militant, said at that time to us, "You've got a commercial Jesus and a religious Santa Claus." And the context in which she was using it, she was referring to our dollars and our material wealth, that our Jesus is a dollar, and that our God is really a kind of a Santa Claus that gives us what we want if we're very nice to him. And I think that that's part of the hang-up on reparations and the Black Manifesto, is they're really, blacks are really saying, you know, give us this, you owe it to us, and we say, yeah, that's right, we do, but that's money you're asking for. And you know, it's the truth of Mattie Humphrey's statement just really got me right in the very heart of me. I don't know what I'd do if someone came in and said, we like your parish and you owe us reparations, so we're going to take it over. That's a little different than what you're doing, but you know,
I think this is a good point to give Frank a chance to talk, because that's just exactly what happened to him this summer when the Cookman Church was occupied. Frank, what's your response and thinking about all this?
Well, I think the first response is I think we have to look very carefully at the 12 people who are here and see who is not here. I think that's very significant. Because what has happened here is we have set up a group of black persons who, as near as I can see, and every indication I have, represent a small minority of the black community. And you've set up a group of other persons who, by and large, as far as I know, do not live under the very circumstances that we're concerned about here. Now, I think that's a setup. So I'm not sure there could be any real meaningful discussion here. So I'm going to be a loner at the very outset. This summer, a group, and I'm not really sure who the group is because it changed, but a group of persons, at least the beginning of them, out of another church in the neighborhood of Cookman, came into Cookman without prior notice. Although, as a matter of fact, 4 months before this, one member who did come in had been invited to put on paper, and said he would, a proposal that I had promised to back for how they could operate in the church. In any case, they came in. Now, slogans go fast and loose. And I think most of the people involved in a situation like this really are not in a position to know very much about it. So I felt the best thing to do would be to see who was inside and who was outside. And what did they feel? I had responsibility for the program in this church, not because I solicited it, not because I held on to it, but because we acquired it by default. Other groups wouldn't accept the responsibility. So I waited. Well, the first thing that happened, we got over 100 letters in the first 2 days, all from people who said they were black, all saying we support you in your position. Then I got telegrams from black clergymen of the churches surrounding Cookman, saying they thought it was a shame and disgrace what this group had done, and do not give in. Then I got one of the men who, again, says he's black, who's very well known in the city, who came to me and said, "Frank, don't give them a thing." Then I got a call from some people from the Archdiocese office. On a personal basis, just said, "We're praying for you. Is there anything we can do to help?" Then I asked about the Council of Black Clergy. Now, who's included in this? And they said, well, all the black churchmen except a few. And I said, which denominations aren't represented? Well, the Baptists, of course the Roman Catholics, the Holiness Group by and large. They went down the list. Well, then when I began to look these up in the calendar, this represents 3/4 of the black churches. So I began to wonder. Then I looked at my own conference minutes. Now, I'm sure you're getting squirming right now. I looked at my own conference minutes and I saw the black ministers in our own conference who were very strongly in support of what we were doing, and the ones who were critical of it. And in the most recent conference minutes, without exception, the ones whose churches were thriving were for us, and the ones who had declining memberships were questioning. We also found that black people who lived in Chestnut Hill were very critical of us. But black clergymen who had been struggling over the years with the problems on Lehigh Avenue called me up at 8 o'clock in the morning, came over to the house to pray with me at night. Now, maybe 90% of the black community is wrong. Maybe these gentlemen who were here are right. But certainly no white man should come and say he is any person to judge what black people want. So what I tried to do is simply what the majority of black people told me that they wanted. Now, they have shown that since. For example, 30 people who live next to Cookman took it completely on their own, because I certainly didn't want to put them in a difficult spot. Took it on their own to get together and give us a petition saying that they wanted us to understand that this group that was inside in no way represented what they wanted. Later on, I had a meeting, and I found out that in one of our city departments, they had been threatened over the phone. Now, maybe this is not true, but this is what I was told in the presence of a commissioner. And the person was putting his job in jeopardy to say this, that the Black Panthers called him and threatened him that if they did not come up and repudiate Cookman, that there'd be all kinds of trouble. I know that there were threats made to our bishop about what would happen if he didn't go along with them. Now, under those circumstances, I do believe in a democracy. I've lived 15 years in North Philadelphia. I believe in reparations. I believe very deeply in it. I think reparations means to be concerned enough to go as a servant. And that's what I've tried to do. But I've had to listen to somebody. I've had to ask people what they wanted. What do they want me to do? Where do they want me to serve? I've had to have an ear for it. That's why I've lived in North Central Philadelphia for 15 years, so I could understand what my neighbors want. Because I am concerned about this, because I did grow up in a relatively affluent place. This is why my children go to public school at Ferguson School, one of the lowest ranking in the city. because I want my neighbors to know I do care about what happens to my daughter, so I care about theirs. That's why we have so many school children in our school, in the church afterward.
Frank,
So
I think-
I'm saying, I
yeah.
think, and that the irony of this thing, and I'm not going to let go either, the irony of this thing is that people who made the pronouncements, virtually no one, asked Cookman first, what is your program? No one tried to check.
Excuse me for interrupting you, Mr. Counsel. I've been letting you go on, giving your points as if there was no question about them.
Sure.
And obviously, there's two sides. And,
Fine.
and since I was one of the people involved with Cookman, I happen to know about another side. For instance, it's interesting how you forgot to mention a petition that had 3,000 names on it, taken in the community where Cookman is.
Did anyone see it?
Yeah, I saw it, and it was directed to your offices. But I don't think that's the point of the discussion this morning.
Why wasn't this ever brought to us? We asked for it.
The person who was responsible for doing it, I'm sure, did or tried. Probably what happened, which was happening all the while, when we tried to talk to your offices, we couldn't get an answer. That's probably what
Mr.
happened.
Haynes was in the house the entire time. We had staff there 24 hours a day for the entire time. And your group was, Bob, you were in and made a long-distance phone call on his phone, didn't you?
Sure.
Did you have any problem getting in?
No.
Did you use the phone in the office?
The point is, you probably had trouble reaching Mr. Hipple, or perhaps Frank, I don't know.
And the bishop.
Well, of course, unfortunately, very unfortunately, the bishop was out of town.
But, what I'm trying to say is I don't think I don't think we're here to debate the issues at Cookman, because if we were, we would have the people who knew about it at hand. I think that
I'm here.
Yeah, right. Well, but as I said, I don't think we're here to debate that.
That's exactly the point, and
May I
that's
ask
what
you-
concerns me.
may I ask you a
If you're
question?
right in general, but not in particular, what about it?
I was going to ask you a question. If
Sure.
you want me to stop so you can ask me a question, I'll be glad to. But I was
Fine.
in the process of
Go
asking
ahead.
you one. The question I'd like to ask you is, well, there's one little curious question. I didn't know what you meant when you said the person who came to you who professes to be black. What did you mean by that?
Well, I would say that certainly I don't know what, this word black means. When I've said to someone that this is a person who is black, who said this, someone says to me, well, but they weren't black. And all I'm trying to say is that since I didn't see them face to face, if someone writes to me and says,
I thought you said he came to you. I'm talking about a person you mentioned. So you said a person came to you and said he said he was black, or he professed to be black. The implication was that he might not have been.
well,
I was wondering what
as
you
a matter
meant
of
by
fact, I'm talking about a particular person who makes a great many statements in the press, and very often people have said, oh, well, he's not black.
Let me say something, Jim, if you don't mind. First of all, as Jim has pointed out, we didn't come here to talk about that Cookman situation, but evidently that's all that's on your mind, Mr. Kenso.
This was the question
Let
asked
me
me.
go on. You're interrupting
This was-
me. You went on for about 5 or 10 minutes. The thing that bothers me, and it isn't, my question isn't going to be addressed to you particularly, because I would definitely not want to do that, because you're not going to be able to deal with it, evidently. But the thing that bothers me is, out of our previous discussion, we sat in here, the group of us, and we talked about the demand for reparations. We talked about its legitimacy, and this man, you have sat there and said you believe in reparations, because what you believe in it may be questionable. But this is the problem. Here is a man who would sit up, and I trust that you will understand me, because I say this with all Christian humility, whatever that means, that you have sat there with so many lies, to put it very frankly and candidly, about that Cookman situation, that when we talk to gentlemen who are going to be willing to deal with the question of reparations, how do you begin to deal with this kind of situation? That's the question I want to, how do you begin to deal with that?
Well, I think it also brings out the idea of the modality, the way in which you do things, because if there were threats back and forth, that certainly changes the situation. It no longer is a discussion on the real deep religious part of it, but it becomes an actual confrontation, and people are afraid of one or another, and you have people calling on the phone. That changes the whole thing around. It makes it a very practical thing.
You're right, Phil, and I would contend that where there are threats made, if that is the case, that I would want to document that.
That's
you
right.
see,
It's always rumors.
I would
think
always want,
practical
you see, when
situation.
you throw in rumors and you're not able to document it, then I can consider them nothing but rumors. When
But it
you
is part of the way things get done, though. As soon as something happens in the public, it becomes a confrontation. All these things are side issues of it, and it becomes very difficult to handle it in a very calm, rational way.
Yes, but churchmen,
You
know,
should make the
churchmen
effort.
throw the fat in the fire. You know, that's where we have a problem. I'm asking, how do you deal with that so that churchmen don't start to camouflage the real issues with a bunch of erroneous kinds of statements?
Yeah, well, Vaughn, I think it's true that, threats are probably made in these situations, and they do need to be documented when possible, but documented or not, in other words, if you can prove that it was or wasn't, really doesn't change the basic structure of the situation. In a kind of controversial and highly charged situation, you're going to have things like this. You can't lay any standard of perfection on either the black militant groups who are attempting to bring these matters to the nation's attention or on churchmen or anybody else. In the midst of a highly emotional and charged situation, you're going to have that. The thing that disturbed me, I think, more than anything else about this explanation of what happened at Cookman was the attempt to decide the situation on the basis of adding up signatures or groups of 30 or 60 or the people in the immediate neighborhood or so forth. I think one of the points that's made very clear in the introduction to the Black Manifesto is a recognition on the part of the people who prepared it that in the black community there are a great many people who do not understand the realities of the present situation in the same way they do. I can certainly say that in the white community and in the white church there are an awful lot of people who don't understand things the way I do in regard to the racial situation in our country, historically, in the present, and in the hopes for the future. But I don't think we get anywhere as responsible churchmen trying to decide what's right and what's biblical and what the church really ought to be trying to do as it follows its Lord by going out and seeking to line up groups of people on one side or the other. The questions having to do with reparations, it seems to me, that are incumbent upon us to try to answer some attempt to understand historically the roots of our present situation and the relationship of church bodies to the present, and then to decide in the light of the gospel what is required of us, not in the light of how many of our members line up on one side or the other, or how many people in one neighborhood or another may line up on one side or the other.
I think another thing, Dean, is that we should also be concerned with how we are going to be successful in doing what is required and doing what is right, and that means being concerned also about where the people are.
But what does success mean in this context?
The success in the Christian sense of convincing people and persuading people that something that ought to be done is done.
Both of you, are saying something that I'd like to question. You say you find out. Both of you are basically saying, I think, that we have to find out what's wrong, and then we do something about it. Well, who are these we's?
The idea that the black people in the Black Manifesto are calling for reparation for damage that the Jewish community throughout the world. And it was relatively easy in making an appropriation of reparations funds to funnel it into a place where it would be used by the established, organized Jewish leadership. The question I raise, therefore, is how do those who are asked to respond with reparations in the Black Manifesto, how do they determine the entitlement of the BEDC or of any black group? How do they determine that they're entitled to receive the funds and that the funds that are given to them will go to the place where it belongs, namely to the total black people of America?
Well, I think the answer to that has been clearly demonstrated by the way in which those already. Before I start, let me affirm your point. I think your point's well made, and I think this is one of the tricks of integration, is that black people have not met their responsibility in putting forth official representation of their group. In fact, the whole integration process tended to make black people think they didn't need to organize as a group and not have representations. And I stand where you stand. I think it is the responsibility of the black community to put forth official representations. But I think in response to the manifesto, this has been happening. I think that we've seen that all of the legitimate church groups, the National Council of Black Churchmen, the Black Methodists, the Black Caucus and the Episcopal Church, all the black caucuses have backed the manifesto. Now, since the manifesto group is not a government agency, which makes you parallel a little where it doesn't fit quite exactly, obviously, as far as the black church is concerned, that we're all prepared to recognize the Black Economic Development Conference as the legitimate organ to receive these funds. And I think since the uses of this money is going to be so public and since its accountability is going to be so easy, that there's no problem, because all of this has got to be accounted for, and its goals are obviously for the benefit of black people. I think the parallel breaks down because we're not talking about governments, but your point is still, I think, a good point.
Phil, how do you think the average Catholic feels about this Betsy and about the whole black reparations thing?
I don't know any average Catholic. There are a lot of Catholics. But it seems strange, though, when you look at the reaction of the general public to the whole movement here, that one wonders why there isn't more of a positive response from listening to the discussion of both the last segment and also the beginning of this one, that if it is so very clear that this is a justified movement, that it is so very clear that this ought to be, then how can we account for the fact that the response to it has not been a very good one? I mean, it's obvious that it has not been a very good one, has it, across the country? So what is involved? What is happening? What are people thinking? I think it's a very important issue for us to listen to what the people are saying about this. What is in their mind? How do they relate it to their own experience? How do they put it into the gel of their own attempts to for self-determination, etc. So I think that this is part of it, and that's why in that last segment when I mentioned that when we're involved ever in attempting any kind of a moral persuasion on something that is right and good, that we have to begin with where the people are to find out what is in their mind as we attempt to open up all of us to see what is right and what ought to be done. So I think that, and I've listened often and read a fair amount about the difference between rhetoric and the substance, that somewhere at the heart of the movement there is the substance, and it seems to me that the substance is this question of self-determination. People have a right for self-determination, which certainly we all agree with. Certainly the Catholic community agrees with it. It's going to all sorts of pain and effort to achieve self-determination on its own. That's one large substantive item, I would say. The other is the question of money to achieve that, because we know even though money may be the source of evil, it is also necessary to do what is good. Schools and homes and employment all involve money in some way. So money and self-determination. Who can disagree with that? But then there is the overtone here now of a notion of reparation. And this is where it affects people's thinking and their own background, their own experience. It is difficult for a people, and you mentioned the average Catholic, I think I can speak a little bit about the Catholic background, who feel that they themselves have attempted a similar type of movement in American society, with some who knows how to compare the various levels of discrimination, but with some obstacles. And the money part of it was done by a great deal of voluntary contribution. At the present time, the effort is being made to have society share with the Catholic community some of the general funds for what it has done over the years to assist in the education of children in America. And we feel very strongly this is a positive thing. Some connotation of reparation might be introduced there, but we have not done that. The other thing is self-determination. Yes, we believe very strongly in self-determination. There should be schools. There should be ways and means for the black people of America to achieve the self-determination and all that implies. But who must share the sense of guilt for what American history has produced? How are you going to today convince in a real way people that they do share this guilt? People who themselves feel that their own experience has been part of the whole process. How do you do it? How do you speak to a group of people who are primarily immigrant people? How would you do it if you had to make the effort? They feel that
Which group are you saying is primarily immigrant people?
I'm talking generally about Roman Catholic people,
Well,
and
there are an
large
awful lot of-
numbers of Italian, Irish, Polish, German.
There were an awful lot of Roman Catholic immigrants who immigrated with 12 black slaves. That was what Bishop Lacassis called
Yeah.
for when he encouraged the Vatican to sanction African slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe some of the latter Catholics came in the latter years, but there were an awful lot of Catholics on the ground floor of the building of this Western Hemisphere.
Yeah, well, Father Woodward, this history part of it, I'd like to know an awful lot more about it, but there are facts of history and there are general sweeps of history. The
That's a
general
fact.
sweep of Catholic history in America is that we had large groups of immigrant people who came here in the largest numbers, certainly long after slavery had become a pattern in America.
but there-
But very proximately after, there had been famines in Ireland, for example, and famines which were induced almost by people in authority and in control who took the food from the people and sold it for their own economic gain, and these people were subjected to that. They came here to flee from that.
I don't think there's any denial of the fact that in certain segments of America, Roman Catholics have been discriminated against, because of their religion. But on the whole, they haven't moved.
And also their nationalities.
Yeah. Well, even at that, though, the point I'm making is they didn't move into the mainstream, so to speak, of American life because they were or were not Catholics. They moved into the mainstream because they were Caucasian. And the issue we're talking about is not a Roman Catholic over against a Protestant or a Jewish issue. It's a racial issue. We're talking about Caucasian groups as opposed to Negroid or European groups as opposed to African groups. And I think that there's, the point is, despite the problems that white immigrant groups went through, there was never any legal legislation of the nature that was used against Africans. There was never any tradition or moray,
Yeah.
and there's no comparison.
No, I agree with all that
And
what you're
the
saying,
point is-
but
one
how
more
do you
point.
convince people such as this that they are
One more
guilty of
point.
something?
One more point, and I don't want to introduce, as some of you probably know, one of my fields is African and Afro-American history, so the things I say come from strong documentation, and I'm aware of the immigrant patterns. I'm not just talking about them. I know when the waves came. I know where the waves were affected, and in general, it's safe to say that the immigrants who were encouraged to come from Europe were encouraged to come at the exclusion of Afro-American rural dwellers in the South who were excluded from business, even when they immigrated to the
Well, you
north.
can't blame that on the immigrant people. They
No.
came under regulations
But
that
I
had been
can-
established here prior to their arrival.
Excuse
Well, Phil,
me, excuse me, Monsignor. I'm not finished. And the point I'm trying to make is
But I don't
that
think
the
we're- I
industry
think we're
they
having a
walked
dialogue,
into.
Father Wilbur, where we both, say a thing.
Well, I'm trying to
I
finish
can-
my point.
Fine.
The industry they walked into
Yes.
was built as a result of the industry in America. In other words, they got a job. It's just like a person who is a fence takes stolen goods from the stealers. That makes him an accomplice. That's the point. By being a part of a system that was built on slavery.
What
they
sort of a
benefited
sense
by
of
it.
guilt would a poor Irish laborer have who comes over here and works his head off laying tie on a railroad? Is he responsible for what some gigantic corporation did in regard to the railroads? He's a slave himself.
Well, neither is the person who buys the stolen commodity. The cops come and arrest him for it, and he didn't even know it
But see,
was stolen.
today, you seem to be saying to people generally that you are guilty for all these past
Well, but
bad
Phil,
things to our
isn't it
history.
clear that, wouldn't we all agree that today the Roman Catholic Church, Protestant churches, and Jewish synagogues are rich, over the hundreds of billions
No,
of
from
dollars?
all I know about our problems with our school system, we're not very rich. We're
Well,
running a
yeah, but
deficit
we've
school
got
system.
billions of dollars in property and investments and income.
Now, let me separate it out a little bit because
Okay.
we're in trouble.
All right,
we
but
need money for our self-determination too.
All right, but the point I'm trying to make is
And,
we're
but we
rich.
shouldn't have the poor people contending with one another for that money that's available. I hate to be contending with you people for what is available
Well,
because I feel we both have the right to
issue
it.
is, though, we are rich. We have billions of dollars. And we all have benefited economically and politically from the subjugation in times past and discrimination in times present of the black people in this country. And while I have sympathy for what you say about the Roman Catholic, I don't think you would feel, or nor would I, that this is on a scale in American history
Well, I'd like
with
to
what's
interrupt
been
just
done
to
to the
say that
blacks.
I really agree with that last part, that it is on the basis of what we are experiencing today, that if we are involved in discriminatory patterns today, that is where we should feel guilty.
Well,
And
what
it's
about
out
the
of
reparations
that we should act, not something in the
beyond,
past.
I think it goes beyond that, because Catholics or any white group could not be
That's
where
right.
they are today.
That's
They
the point.
couldn't enjoy the things they enjoy
Yeah.
had it not been for the particular structures of racism that have oriented our society in the way it's been. So that, I don't know whether
the
you, I
idea
don't know
of
whether you
guilt.
talk
It's
about
guilt.
guilt in this way.
I
but-
didn't raise guilt.
But-
The notion of reparation raised the issue of guilt.
Yeah, but the fact of the matter,
The
the fact of
bishops
the
of the
matter
Catholic
is,
Church have said that really the question of guilt is a very, very hazy thing. Unless the person himself has chosen with full recognition of the situation, I deliberately choose to do this evil thing against that person, it's hard to
yeah,
do.
but,
See,
the
I
fact,
think-
but
I
see,
think,
the fact of the matter is that we do choose to do this evil thing against that person, because where we are today and where black people are today are intimately related, and this is as true for white. Predominantly Catholic immigrant groups, perhaps more true than other groups.
I
So
think the
therefore,
poor
there's
people
a
are more
direct
intimately
tie.
related.
No, there's a
poor
direct
people.
tie between what we have and what black people do not have.
That's right.
And we are responsible for what they do not have.
And I think what you're doing, and I think perhaps this is where we're, not to get into a semantic game, but I think that there's a difference between blame and responsibility.
Right.
I think because if you're drunk and driving down the street and you kill somebody, you're responsible, whether you intended to or not. And you may not be guilty in the sense that it was your fault, other than the fact it was your fault you took the drink. I think that, and I think it's dangerous, for the white community to all of a sudden say, that these things have been happening. Because this raises serious questions. Didn't they see the treatment of black people all these years? Haven't they been watching it all the while? And you have to ask, sure, you can become unconscious to things, but you're responsible for becoming unconscious. And I think all depth psychologists
I think
agree
that's
on
really
that.
something different than reparations for the
that point
past.
is a very important point that I was hoping would be developed to its full. I think that it's put on the wrong plane when it's put in terms of guilt. Because while there are undoubtedly those who should feel guilt, there are many who are able to feel that they are not guilty. But when it comes to responsibility, one of the things that Jews are very mindful of is that there are millions of Germans living today who lived during the Nazi era and say, I had nothing to do with it.
That's right.
And they feel that is a complete disclaimer of responsibility. But to the Jewish people, that's not an acceptable disclaimer. The fact that it was going on while they were there and that they did nothing about it makes them responsible.
Yes, yeah. That's the present. That's out of the
And
present.
isn't that
There's
true
a-
about the
there's a
ghetto
thing.
today?
There's a thing.
Yes, but it's
There's an
today.
aspect, there's an aspect of all of that. I think that it's really dangerous to try to avoid. Is that as in the case with the Jews making reparations demands upon Germany, Jews were not, the demand was not that, some given German farmer, who had next to nothing, give up part of what he had to be about the business of paying restitution. It was not that. It was the relationship of one group to another. It was a group and institutional question. And that the case with the church and, looking at the Catholic Church, that it begs the question to raise whether or not some poor Irish immigrant has a reparations debt. What we're talking about is an institutional relationship.
Yeah, well, okay, let's talk about the institutional relationship. Where do you feel the funds that the Catholic Church come from? They come from these people.
An awful lot
Voluntary
came from the
contribution.
colonial domination of Latin American countries. That's where an awful lot of funds of the Roman Catholic Church came from. And from owning actual plantations, owning actual setups where slaves worked. That's how the Roman Catholic Church got a lot of its funds in the
America?
16th, 17th, and 18th
American
century.
Roman
It's
Catholic
one
Church?
church, isn't it?
I mean, in America, North America.
In the Western Hemisphere, in the South America and North America.
Oh, South America. I don't
Yeah.
know an awful lot about South America.
Well, the church is there.
But I mean, we're talking about the North America situation where most Roman Catholics are
Do you
immigrant
look at
people on the
Do
eastern
you look
coast.
at the United States' Roman Catholic Church as separate from the Roman Catholic Church? The funds that
There
are
are
controlled by the
differences.
Vatican?
There are certain different. Of course, there are. And that's the thing about the institutional church. The funds come from the people. They come from the voluntary contributions of the
And
people.
they came from the involuntary contributions of black workers. That's what we're saying.
And the thing is, it's really not fair, and the thing that we can't permit ourselves to let slide by. As a matter of fact, that in the case of the Catholic Church does not exist by and large at this stage of the game on the basis of donations
That's right.
from the people in mass.
You know,
Let me-
Muhammad,
I could talk
I
about
like to
Chicago's
say-
slum property owned by the Roman Catholic Church.
No, not when you speak as if you have that gigantic information and knowledge about the Catholic Church. I mean, I live in the Catholic Church, and I do know that the Catholic Church survives on the voluntary contributions of its people.
What about the land holdings
what
it
all I'm
has?
saying is that
in Chicago?
I would appreciate you allowing me, to finish what I'm saying. That's just a basic kind of courtesy.
Yeah, I know.
There are a couple of things. One is that the Catholic Church, is in this country, in North America, not
Right,
just in South
right.
America. The Catholic Church, does own tremendous amounts of property, the church does have multi-million-dollar investments.
Do you
that the
think
church
that,
is-
can I intervene there, Muhammad? Because you're talking about my church, see?
Right.
And then you're talking about as if you know everything about it.
Oh, no, I'm not.
Now,
making
now
that
we're
statement.
involved right now with a school system and that is in trouble because it doesn't have money. Now, do you really believe that the Catholic Church is so wealthy that it's holding back money and letting the school system go down the drain and not use all this
No,
gigantic amount of
it's
money
not-
for
one of the
it?
questions-
It's kind of silly.
No, I think the point is, Father, I think, if we want to get into this, we can. You said this before, and it went by, and I let it go by because I don't agree. I don't see the parochial system as a school subsidizing public education. I see it as a very exclusive movement to propagate certain ideas. Now,
How
we
about
could debate that.
self-determination?
But let me
What's
make
the
my point.
difference between
My point is
self-determination and the parochial school
that
system?
given your present budget, is apparently that's the only way to talk to you, is just keep talking.
That's right.
Apparently, in the present budget, you're having trouble. Sure, because that's when what we're raising, what the manifesto is raising, is the question of priorities. Question of, what are the priorities? Given your present priorities, which are racist, sure, you're running out of money. But if you were to talk about a different priority, perhaps it would be a different situation.
Can I
And if
say
you're going to
something?
defend
Can I
the fact
say
that Roman
something
Catholic
now?
Church is not
Can I
racist, then
say
we can have
something
a
now?
real good argument.
Can I say something now?
Because I say my own church is racist, too.
Can I say something now?
Right.
What's the difference between your notion of self-determination and running a parochial school system?
The point is that the church has a responsibility to the society in which it finds itself. I personally think that parochial education ducks that responsibility. This is a personal opinion, and I said we could debate it. It wasn't the point I was making. The point I'm making
I
is,
just want to ask the question.
I'm simply saying there's another side to that argument. It isn't as clean as you made it sound. There's a side that could
And
The
it's
unfortunate side of it all is that so often the poor people wind up in conflict with one another when the real people who are able to control and make the decisions are not affected by it. So the thing reduces itself to the poor inner city people, white and black. They wind up at each other's throats, and they are the people who are being subjugated by the whole thing of priorities, of the budgets, etc. Why isn't there enough homes for people to move into? Do you think the poor people who live in the city can control that? Why aren't there enough schools? Do you think the poor people in the city can control that?
No one has addressed
complete relevance.
the manifesto.
Because
the
you talk
manifesto
about
is not addressed to
poor
poor
white
people
people.
in the
It's
city.
See, that's where you don't understand the
Manifesto-
institution of the Catholic Church.
The manifesto is addressed
Because it's people.
to church institutions, and it addresses itself to the question of the institutional wealth of those.
Yeah, Mr.
of
Kenyatta,
those
did you read the
churches.
paper last week about the Catholic Social Services, the Catholic Charities Appeal? That is the
I'm not-
institutional
I'm not
church.
gainsaying that, Phil. What you're going
That
to have to
gains
do,
from
Phil, what you're gonna have to do,
voluntary
and it may be hard,
contributions.
is what you're going to have to do is to, as a start, to try to suspend your judgment, to try, and at least let ideas get across. I mean, I think one of the problems
Well,
has
that's why
been
I listened for the
an
previous hour to all the
an
ideas.
overreaction, just on the surface.
But
Now,
when you
and
listen
I'll
to
show
what
you
I'm
a
trying to say,
direct
then just one
example.
thing.
A specific
That
example
the
is a
whole
case.
Catholic Social Services runs on voluntary contributions of its people. If you're able to see that, then you have listened to me, and I'll be very
Right.
happy. about it.
I hear that. I think that's
Fine.
good that
Okay.
people should be about that kind of work. I'm not gainsaying that. But there are specific cases. Just to cite a case, there's a school, a Catholic school in Delaware County, in Chester, St. Anthony's School, which, has been an all-white parish, which has began as an Italian national parish. There's documentation, that the parish was eventually integrated, i.e., non-Italian Catholics, were brought in to make out the school population, and eventually even Protestant whites. But the overriding fact there is that there's a school in the middle of the black community for, and the one admissions criteria that will not be dropped is, the whiteness.
Yeah.
Okay,
Well,
now
no,
that's a matter of
again,
fact. Now
you were
what
saying
happens
things
is,
about fact
what
which are
happens
not fact, because I
what
do know
happens
more
is that
about
in
than
that
you do.
case,
That
No,
there
what
is a
happens is that in
policy
that case,
out of our
there
school
is-
system that there's no
Can
Protestant
you
white
give him an answer
children.
when he finishes?
No, because I won't get a chance. See, there'll be too many things along the
Well,
line.
just keep talking.
I think it's a
Fight for-
no,
Okay,
no.
what-
I think it's a
what
case where
happens,
we can
in that case-
interrupt one another, and I'll stop. And when
Why don't you continue
There
for a
is a-
moment, and then we'll
Right.
all agree that Phil Dowling gets a chance to
Sure.
reply.
Now, what happens in that case, and I'm, just talking now from the results of, discussion with the priest of that particular church. One of the things that he pointed out is that indeed his church is faced with pressing problems, and that he cannot be about, he does not have, the wherewithal to be about, making the kind of response that he maybe should be making to the black community, or what have you, and that there is a case, where there is maybe some sense of pitting poor white against poor black,
Oh,
but we
yeah.
see, that at the back of that is in fact that that tremendous institution, the church. And that it's interesting to me, and confusing to me, that you would attempt to lay at the feet of the Black Manifesto movement the charge that must be laid at the feet, in this case, of the church, of the Catholic Church in this particular case. The charge, that what has happened has been that the institution has, deliberately or unconsciously, been about the business of trying to set the poor, the black, the poor, the white, against one another, while the church has been, recalcitrant in fulfilling its own obligations.
I don't see the consequence of that last part, but the part about any sort of a policy, I do know what the policy is in regard to Protestant white people who we love very much. But when it comes to entering our suburban schools, precisely for this reason, there is a policy that no non-Catholic enters a school which has a full capacity.
That's what I meant about exclusive. That's what I meant.
Yeah, of course, it's a Catholic school system.
That's right.
But in the inner city, as a service to the community because of the desire of the people, non-Catholic students are taken in.
Yeah,
And
in
that is done.
this case, non-Catholic white students.
No,
What I'm saying is
Negro
there is a
students,
case.
Negro students.
I'm saying that there is a case. It's 3 blocks down the street from my house. There's a case where, you have a very blatant and crude and backward kind of racism.
Yeah.
And rather than being about the business of ministering educationally to those people, that I must hold you personally,
Yeah.
Accountable for that, given your role.
You're right.
Rather
I
than
do
being about the
recognize
business of,
that in our
responding to
community,
the
as in,
educational
as
need
in
of those
communities
people.
generally, we have discrimination. We all know that. That's what it's all about.
Can I
The
ask a
discrimination.
question
ahead,
on
go
that?
ahead.
That is, the original focus of this conversation, before we got off on this, and I think it's been very interesting, but the original focus was on your question, I believe, was how do you, Paul, how do you tell the people in
Right.
your faith and in
Right.
all the Christian and Jewish faiths, what's going on? How do you get them to accept
Right.
the manifesto, what its demands, how you get them to accept the Black Economic Development Conference, how you get them to, from the point, they aren't even at the point we are. Most of the people that I talk to are at the point of saying, what do these black bandits want?
Yeah.
Who are they to walk into our living room and say, give me money? And we've got a heck of an educational job to do just to get people to understand
Yeah.
the kind of things that lie behind this dialogue. And I think...
Yes, I agree. That's the
And, the point I was trying to make in the original response to that, and I think, you sort of laid a basis for it, is that, a consequential question, a subsequent question, a commensurate question is, how could it go all this time, and not be
Exactly.
dealt with? And then you begin to look, for instance, at the nature of American education, whether it's parochial or public, where you find a total distortion of the history of America, to the extent that you can find white Americans believing that black people are lazy and shiftless, and that's the reason that we're poor. And if we would just get up and work, everything would be fine. And even pass off information such as the fact that black people are lazy. And I heard Stokely Carmichael say once, which I think is so profound and so simple, how in the hell could we be lazy if we were brought here to do the work of white people? And this is a fact that everybody knows, and yet everybody goes on believing that black people are poor and in trouble in America in terms of the economic, being left out in economic impotence because of our own fault.
Yeah.
And of course, this is the key issue, and what it really raises is what we were getting at before. How, as Carroll was getting at before, how, in the last session, how can one confess and not mean anything by that confession, not mean that, that I've done anything wrong, just say the words.
This has bothered me. The Christian has always said, and in my own church has said it over the years, we love our black brother, or we love anyone that's downtrodden, and we're all together and we're going to help them. But it's in the nature of passing a resolution, or it's in the nature of praying. God knows we need a lot of prayer.
Yeah.
But it's not in the nature of action. The thought of a Christian, and I'll be immediate here and now for a minute instead of there and then, walking through the ghettos in Philadelphia, and not saying, I as a Christian cannot let this exist.
Right.
I don't go back to my home and say, boy, I went through the North Philadelphia ghetto and that was hell. They got to go and say, I got to change it. I got to tell Mayor Tate to change it. I got to tell the governor to change it. I got to tell the President of the United States to change it.
Because
That's here and now. That's
I
here
get
and now.
mad at
That's-
Kenyatta because he doesn't ask for enough.
Yeah, but I-
500 million. The President of the United States ought to get up and make a statement like Kennedy did to put a man on the moon and say a national objective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Within the next 10 years, we will eradicate ghettos. And we'll spend billions on it. And, and then everybody
But I
says
feel
yes or no.
Don't you
out of
think
a
if-
present sense of responsibility, not through some mystic type of.
Yeah, but
I'm not trying to dodge
past.
the-
Right,
the
I
guilt of
think
the
this
past,
is
but
one
I'm
of the
saying that's the here
problems.
and now.
One of the problems that you have in trying to communicate the the reasonableness of the demand in the Black Manifesto
That's
is
all I was trying to say.
that it is our habit of thought, and I think understandably and legitimately, that this is too big a problem to be dealt with as a problem of the churches. The churches have been doing certain things, and granted, it's not enough. And
It's
and
too big a
it's-
problem for us not to deal
But,
with it.
no, but what I'm saying is that the magnitude of it has to be measured in billions, tens of billions, not in hundreds of millions, and that a proposal to raise $500 million is a proposal to scratch the surface. And many of us who've been involved in this for a long time have recognized that we must get the government to accept responsibility, and we've had a terrible feeling of frustration in recent months because the government seems to be turning its back and walking away instead of moving in the direction it should be going.
Well, and, I was going to identify, and of course, this is a pattern that we have to become very aware of in American society, and we have to face it for what it is. If, for instance, a personal family came to any of us who do any counseling or something with the same kind of a pattern of behavior, which is that you've got a priority problem right in the middle of your family, and you keep doing nothing about it, we would call that what it is. That's mental illness. That's the inability to deal with reality. And what we're saying here is that everybody, including the churches, keeps fleeing to fantasy, keeps ducking the issue, keeps talking about other priorities. This is the same pattern of any mentally ill person that you see. So what do? You start dealing with therapy. You start showing people what the consequences of this are. And, and this is all that the manifesto does.
A thing that has happened, in fact, is that the manifesto, has called upon churches to join in the struggle for a total reparation, for the total struggle for Black liberation, for redressing imbalance, for setting the scales straight, And I think that what's happening here, and in a way, the churches should view it as a training ground. Let's get about this is merely the milk and bread. Let's eat this up and get down to the meat of the issue. But I certainly cannot expect a man to be a stable ally in my struggle against this monstrous and racist government, and it is, to be a stable ally in a struggle against that government for governmental reparations, if he is quibbling about what we have sat here and said is not enough money to scratch the surface.
Well, I think here's an issue, though. I think this likening it, this problem of priorities, I think, is a very urgent one. It seems to me that we have a confused voice, though, at this point. Because, for example, one of the very overriding things that's being talked about in the country as a priority is in dealing with the problem of separatism. And I think certainly it's confusing for people to see this, of insisting that there is no such thing as a separate but equal education, that there has to be means for assuring integration in housing, in education, and in many ways. Now, the point is, I think we have to view this carefully and see if there isn't a problem that arises. Certainly within our own church, my own personal church fellowships, many of the problems that arose over this whole situation was that the majority of my members are Black. Now, not at Cookman, but I have a parish of 4 churches. The majority of the people in the congregation this morning were Black. I have a funeral tonight. I'll be probably the only white one there. Here's a situation where they're being asked to make a very substantial contribution, you see. We have interracial marriages within our fellowship, within our staff. This puts people on the line. Certainly here we are moving in 2 directions at once.
I think that's that issue of just for the record, the issue of separatism is a false issue. You have interracial marriages in your church. We have interracial marriages on the steering committee of the Black Economic Development Conference. We are not about the business of any kind of false separatism. And I think that's really, again, just, skirting the issue. It seems to me to be precisely.
But you're asking a mixed church, you see, to act as a white church, and I'm saying that you're acting as though the church is all white, and as though
if your church is Black, we're not asking you.
Right. We're not addressing ourselves to Black churches. Not
I think there's another question that you should be answered. It seems to me that one of the problems of the manifesto is that it's clothed in revolutionary terms, and therefore assures rejection by many of the people who you would hope would be responsive to it. Because it's customary when you want to get something across and get acceptance to do everything you can to put it in the most acceptable form. Yeah. And this has been put in the least acceptable form and has really fed all of the law and order and reactionary
Right.
forces who are just looking for
Sure.
good reasons to oppose
Sure.
it.
And let me respond to that, and be very candid about it. And this is not at you, because I hear what you're saying. Let's say it first of all this way: when we acted like Dr. King acted,
Yeah.
what people said was, "We have a glass of water. There's that much water for everybody. White folks control it. We want to change things, but we're going to keep all the water." And in other words, let me help, but I'm not giving up any of the water. That's unreality. That's fantasy. That's what I'm talking about is mental illness. These same mentally ill people that we're talking, I don't really care. And I think what the manifesto says, it doesn't really matter anymore. We can't wait for them to be educated. Black people are suffering, and we're going to make a change. What they have to see is that part of self-determination is to use language that expresses the condition you're in. The American government has no problem with using language of war and revolution, of military power to control the political situation in Vietnam. It doesn't mind. The Bible is full of war terms. God is going to strike the enemy dead. Nobody cares until black people start suddenly saying, we will take it no longer, and we're going to have to move to a military struggle if we don't solve this problem. I don't think it's a question anymore of winning friends. I think it's a question of white Americans realizing we're either going to straighten this problem out or the colored world is going to do something about it. Now, all colored people that I know would like to avoid that. But how long can you wait? And I really don't think it's our business anymore to separate the language. That's how we feel. No longer are we going to scratch our heads and say we're happy, and the white man goes on believing it. Believing we're happy being a slave. Now, that's the white man's problem. And I think it's his problem, and I think it's for people like yourselves who are leaders who understand this to help them see that the language we're using is language we've learned from white people.
And it's also important to understand, just the kind of reality that the language of the manifesto describes. The one little item is people get upset at a passage in the manifesto that says it may be necessary for an armed, black-dominated government to be about the business of educating racism out of America. And folks say, oh my God, communism, fascism, militarism.
Marxism.
But what? The matter of fact has been that it has been necessary to use military force, armed federal troops, to integrate 2 and 3 little colored girls into a school in the South, without mentioning the question of revising the curriculum. Clearly, at this stage of the game, if we were tomorrow to attempt the business of a serious anti-racist educational program in America, it would take force of gun. That's just a statement of fact. And that, we have to, and by we, I mean those who are attempting to address themselves to groups of people. We have to just really stop shilly-shallying and go ahead and tell it like it is, very bluntly and truthfully.
Muhammad, all I'm
Carefully,
asking for
but
is that you
truthfully.
talk about the injustices of today that people do know about, that people can identify, but don't be making them feel guilty about things they have no problem with.
Not to get to that point again, if you're going to take that position, then let's throw all history out. If you're not going to use what happened in the past to make clear what's going on today.
No, I believe in history. I believe that America's history is going to have a
Then
cycle
what are you saying?
that's
Let's
going
not
to
use the things from the past then.
Because guilt is something different.
We're not talking
Guilt is
about
a
guilt.
present
It's not
thing.
guilt.
We're talking about
Reparations
responsibility.
is a fact.
No, reparations is responsibility for past injustices which have present form.
That's right.
Phil, if the
I
leadership...
agree with that, but honestly, I believe in that the history has
You
to be
misheard the
validated.
manifesto. That's the problem you have. You misheard it. You
But there's
got
no
guilt.
question of guilt.
You thought they were trying to make you guilty. It's not that you're guilty because you're driving around in
No.
a car that white folks got from working black folks. It's a fact. You don't have to be guilty about it. Just recognize
It's
it.
very nice that you are conscious about what is courtesy and decent, and then go ahead and say something
I
like
just
that,
learned
because that was
your
kind of a
technique.
bad thing there.
I can play it
And
better
I
than
won't
you.
even listen to. But
Phil,
guilt is a terrible thing to have people worrying about.
No,
Well,
I think
of
what people
course,
have to worry about, let's face it now, we cannot be feeding people pablum.
That's right.
And what people have to do,
Yeah.
if people want to be about the business of saving this country, is to first of all accept some kind of intellectual as well as moral responsibility. And that means that, like it or not, white churchmen have to be about the business, even as some black churchmen are about the business, of explaining some things and making some things clear.
Yeah.
A sociological fact is that any given institution at any period in history is a result of a cumulative process.
Yes, I agree.
And that
I believe
to
in
describe the
history.
institution, you have to describe it in its historical context. Now, what that means is that institutions then do
Do have
have
history.
historical responsibilities, and participants in those institutions must be aware of that if they are to be
that's right.
responsible to the institution.
Responsibility for the present situation, which has come from the past. But also, present institutions, at the given here and moment, have people in them. They're not just an impersonal institution. They have human beings and people with their own experiences. And all I'm asking you is to try to be sensitive to the large number of American people whose own experience is not that different. It is different, there's no doubt. But
I
Phil,
think
what
what
I hear you
Muhammad's
s-
been saying is that they've tried that route.
That's right.
Yeah.
And it's failed. And I was glad to hear
But I hope
Jim
it doesn't
and
lead
Muhammad
to
say
poor
that,
people fighting with one another, because that's a bad thing.
I was glad to see them
And that's what
not
it's
back
liable
off
to.
from the rhetoric.
That's right.
Because
What
I think the rhetoric is...
I wish there was someone else speaking for the Protestant community, too, about the ordinary Protestants.
I speak quiet
parishes
because I thought the Roman Catholics were
Yeah, well, I
doing
know.
swell with it.
Yeah. But see, we're talking about people in general.
One of the real problems of Phil is that, unfortunately, it just seems that you continue to insist that there's no racist
Oh, no,
Roman
no.
institution.
I admit that. I confess.
Oh, well,
I
that's
confess
what we're about.
That I
That's
have
what we're
racist
talking
attitudes in
about.
myself and the neighborhood where I was raised and the schools that I went to. We know that we have them. Our bishops have put it into a very formal way of saying that we know that we have discrimination in ourselves.
Well, yeah.
Today, we must seek to try to eliminate this sense of discrimination from ourselves. And I believe we're trying.
I
I
feel
feel
we're
we're trying.
That's not necessarily the only route, Monsignor. Some other people can help you eliminate it.
Oh,
And I think black people were prepared to play that role.
But you can harm us, too, by putting on a false premise. When you talk about some past kind of a guilt that we have no identification
You keep
with.
saying that. There isn't anything
Well, what do you
there
mean
about
no
past guilt.
identification with, Phil? I sense a lack of real awareness or acknowledgement that white
Bob, if you
America
can get
is
up in
guilty
front of a group of
gross
immigrant people
injustice.
and convince them that they are responsible for what happened on the southern plantation when they themselves came out of a famine situation in Ireland, you are a great preacher.
What I'm trying to say is that, Phil, white America, would you agree with this? White America is responsible for the terrible injustices done to the black man in America, right? Okay. Now, people in power in white America today, among whom are leading Roman Catholic Church, Protestant churches, and Jewish synagogues, we have it within our...
Responsibility.
All right, we have the power and the money, if we really in our gut believe that this injustice was terrible,
Yeah.
to reorder our priorities,
Yes.
to demand that the people that sit on our boards of trustees and that we send to Congress reorder the nation's priorities. But in fact, Foreman, who's given us the chance to do this, we are saying no to him. Now, it seems to me that is denying.
You made a jump from what you've said about we have this obligation and priorities to do all these things. But
Right.
what I think Mr. Foreman has said was everything is in terms of money. That is, it's money to provide for self-determination. That is too narrow an issue.
Well,
It is the thing that you just described.
Let's start with the
You
money.
put people
Before we
on the line.
defend formula, where did you see that in the manifesto that it's primarily money? Because they ask for money, it's primarily money. You conclude that.
I'm not just talking about just what is written there, because
Oh.
the thing is larger
What
than
you're
just
reading in
is
is what you're talking about.
But even
No, I'm talking about
if
what
it
people
is,
hear from it.
but
That's
Phil,
what people hear because
hear,
they
that's
want to hear.
reality.
And if it's just money, let us have a little bit of that for a change. Since we haven't had any of that, we didn't even get paid. And let's talk about
Yeah,
one of your Irish immigrants whose name
they
is
gotten a lot of
Kennedy.
money from America?
Yeah, right. Yeah,
Right on.
Kennedy.
Yeah, but you see, I think the other thing is this,
About
that,
people in general. You're talking about specifics.
That's right. That's what I'm talking about.
but you see, all along, we have been told that, we love you. All along, we have been told that you are our brother, and we care about you. And so, obviously, we've got all your love, but we don't have money.
Father
This is one
Washington,
of the things.
You still got the
could
water
say
in
to
your
you,
glass.
that every Roman Catholic I know would say to you, "You're my brother," I'd feel very happy right now, because not everybody would be able to say that.
Yeah,
Or
but
feel that way
at
about
least
you.
as far as our
and more
documents,
important than
as
that,
far
we
as our
ain't acknowledging
documents
it.
and as far as our pronouncements are concerned, we love you and you are our brother.
But-
this has been,
But there's a big
what the
difference
case has
between
been.
documents and people's actual life.
But you know,
and feeling.
Phil, it seems to me that if we accept, as you are willing to, the basic premise that white America has benefited from the history of institutional arrangements that relegated black people to a particular position and enriched the country, and those of us who are white, and we accept our responsibility to do something to repair that damage
Yeah, I agree, yeah.
and to get over it, then it seems to me that is a great moral problem for us all. And one of the things that concerns me about what you've been saying and about what so many people in the churches have been saying for so long a time is that we seem to have a greater sensitivity for the conscience and feelings of the white people in Catholic and Protestant and Jewish communities who aren't ready to accept their responsibility yet, and we must be easy with them. We have a greater sensitivity to their problem than we do to the
You're accusing me
problem.
of a very horrible thing to do, which I hope I don't do in my life.
Well, I'm not only accusing
And
you
that is
of
trying
that.
to soften people's consciences. My whole business is to be about trying to get people to accept the right conscience. And that is why I say it's so important for anyone who dares to presume to do that with other human beings should attempt to understand the other human beings where they are and to try to say the thing in the way that will draw out of them the goodness that is in them. Because I don't believe that all white people are bad. I believe that there's goodness in white people. And that we have to draw from that goodness. And I believe we can do it on the basis of what we stand for.
And you're willing to say then to all the black people in the country, we're sorry, but you must remain in your present condition until we have
Not at
convinced
all,
enough
not at
white
all.
people.
Not at
Let
all.
me ask
Not at
a
all.
particular question, Monsignor, that we've just going through out in South Bend, a fine Catholic organization. I had a good time at the University of Notre Dame at the Episcopal Convention. And while we were out there, we wrestled with the whole problem, not just of the money that we eventually gave through a pipeline to Betsy, the Black Economic Development Conference, but the recognition of Betsy as a group.
Yeah.
And this is something we argued about here today a little bit. And I'm just curious, not to put you on the spot,
Right.
but since we've been going this way with
Yeah.
you, what do you think it would require of your church, or your archdiocese at least, to say, yeah, Betsy is a group that represents the blacks at this time in history, a coalition of the black liberation movement or the human liberation movement. What would it take for your church to say, yes, recognize the group?
Well, I really
That's,
cannot speak for my
we
church,
fought
but I
for that.
believe
Why did
that
they
from the
say
work
no?
that I do
Why did they say
is
no?
that I think we are at a level even more primary than that, and that is to try to draw from our people their sense of responsibility for where we are now, and to try to see that this is a common cause that we have with other people who have undergone the same type of experience, and that we must not just be self-interested to be concerned only about our own efforts towards self-determination, which we are doing, but also to see others in the same situation and join with them on that basis, that it is a common cause, a common effort, a common suffering, a common situation. But because of that, I feel very harmed when the case is presented so that it turns our people off.
Yeah, but why don't you answer the question instead of going back into your sermon? Why don't
Because
you
I
answer the
did.
question?
I
then?
did
He asked
answer the
you,
question.
why didn't your church say, what would it take for it to say yes? And I'm asking you, why did they say no?
Because that's somewhere down the line. This thing is prior to that.
Okay, Father, you're not going to deal with any
But
questions.
this is a tough question for the white church.
I answered as honest as I
because,
could. You cannot talk about
Your church is
BEDC.
racist. That's the answer, just like mine. That's the answer.
Well,
you know?
it's impressive to me the number of black leaders, I gather, who have come out and have said Betsy is the organization you ought to give the money to. Now, I think people will be interested to know that. Abernathy has said that. Whitney Young has said that. Who are the other people? In other words, a black legitimization of that organization.
Well, just,
All the black
simply,
caucuses.
All the black
all
caucuses.
the black caucuses, the major denominations, Jesse Jackson, Coretta King, Ralph Abernathy of SCLC, Whitney Young, and the leader of the Urban League here in Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, the Citywide Black Community Council. As a matter of fact, Woody Woodland, who at one point worked for the Archdiocese Human Relations Program, is one of the most active, campaigners for the program. What's very, very clear is that there's no problem in the black community, no significant problem with the recognition of the legitimacy of Betsy. One thing, too, that we might add is that in terms of those organizations, that encompass poor whites, there's been no problem with Betsy. A couple of things that people often overlook are, well, number one, the whole demand of the Black Economic Development Conference for monies to assist welfare rights organization. And the bulk of people on welfare in this country are white. Right. Our effort in this field is certainly going to benefit poor whites more than poor blacks. We figure that's necessary. We have to be big enough to accept that kind of responsibility. We have said to the Presbyterians, for instance, that they must release lands in the Southwest to La Raza, to the Chicano people, who are, by the way, Catholic people of color. They have had no problem. Catholic people, Spanish-speaking Catholic people of color, have had no problem understanding and recognizing the legitimacy of the Black Economic Development Conference and the manifesto. That the problem does come, I honestly feel, with those leaders in the church who have become more political than religious in their leadership, and with those segments in the church who have been denied the truth for so long.
Phil, I sit where you do. My denomination said no to Betsy, and it's very hard, but I just feel that my leaders were wrong.
Say yes or no. We said no.
You said no.
Said there was no such thing as Betsy.
Yeah, that's what I say. That's what I'm trying to say. Honestly, that it's a question which is down the line from the more primary
Well,
one.
you keep arguing when it's convenient that the church is made up of these poor people, these poor immigrant racists, and then when we talk about a decision, then suddenly it's the polity, it's the hierarchy. That's a very flip-flop argument.
Not at all, because I don't
know
maybe I'm
what
not
you
such
do.
a good teacher, but I thought I had a little bit of a logic in what I was saying, that you must be able to, if you work with a group that depends upon the people being with you, you have to try to address the people to have them support you.
That's
But the
very
church,
amazing
I
for a
mean,
church
you know,
that
that's a very interesting
that
thing,
takes
because
the
the church, I
authority.
mean, the Christian church
I'm talking about what I
and the
believe the
nature of the
Catholic Church is
Christian
all
church.
about.
Yeah.
What you think is about, what I
Well, the
believe is I
nature,
know it's
look,
about.
the nature of the church has a lot to do with, first of all, the kind of isolated witness of Christ. I mean, you know, Jesus Christ was not a mass leader. He couldn't get as many people, you know, as many disciples as we got to occupy Cookman Methodist Church. Dig it. That's real.
Yeah.
The church, indeed, was forged largely by its experience in the catacombs.
But
I
after
mean,
a couple
it
of
was the
years, he
church-
did get a few more disciples. After a couple of years, he did get a few more disciples.
Right, but what I'm saying is this,
By
what I'm
talking
saying
what
is
he
this,
wanted to say.
Monsignor, that the Christian witness
See,
has
Christ
never been a
didn't just
witness.
die then. He's still around now.
The Christian
He's still got
witness
followers
has never been, at least to my understanding, has never been a witness that finds its justification on a demographic basis. That indeed the justification of the Christian witness has to do with, man's commitment to man and man's commitment to higher values.
Yeah.
And if
Well,
you
Hamlet,
ought
if
to
you're
be
looking for
alone,
witnesses,
if you ought to be alone,
we'll have witnesses.
if
But
you
you're
ought to
looking
be
for a
alone
large number of
with
money.
the truth, then it's best to be alone with the truth than to be, to be pandering to an unfortunately misinformed democracy.
Still, we
Not only
have the
that-
money.
Not only that,
Well,
and
don't worry about
this
it.
is where your
Churches-
argument. This is where your argument really, I think you ought to listen to it yourself.
I'm listening.
A church that excommunicates people for not holding positions, a church that has as much authority over its people, probably more authority than any other single church. You're going to say you have no control over your people. The Quakers back in the 18th century excommunicated Quakers who had a pro-slavery position. And it seems to me all we're saying is that the church take a position. Our church is taking a position, and we're going to see how much authority the church has. Presume the General Convention is being questioned, which is the major litigating body in our church. Well, we're prepared for that fight, and I think that's.
Yeah, well, I mean, really, Father,
Which means, therefore, that where our responsibility is concerned, we cannot wait to ask all of the people, are you with us? You have to recognize what the responsibility is and assume it.
Yeah,
I would think that if a Catholic cardinal endorsed Betsy publicly, that it would have tremendous effect.
Right on.
Not because, your people would just fall into line, but your people would say, hey, wait a minute, I'd better really look into this. It can't be just what I thought. It can't be, somebody holding me up and taking money away. There's something behind
Let's
this.
not just get after the
maybe-
Catholics
maybe-
because they.
maybe he's
Well, he's so
involved in trying to
eloquent
get
about this
people
that I
to
want
people.
to focus on it.
Well, but I think we need to recognize
Because,
that, for example,
as
the council.
Mr. Kinsel said in the beginning, though,
Let's ask
you
Bob
try to have a
Greenfield again.
a real form of an issue. And that is why I tried to bring out the things I tried to bring out, because I believe that what happened in the last segment was not the full impact of this issue in the Philadelphia community today. I tried to put into words what I feel people generally are feeling about this thing. And I tried to bring it out as part of what is actually here. Now, we're talking about the way it is, how things are, the here and now, and however you put it, not just theory
what you
ideas.
brought out, the point that you brought out, I thought it was a very good point. I was kind of bothered that you didn't quite make it clear enough, because I think that, it's probably safe to say that the reaction in the black community to the manifesto has been one of an increasingly positive reaction.
Yeah.
That the reaction in the black community has certainly been, in the white community has certainly been not as positive. In fact, might be negative.
Well,
recently, that's true.
In fact, might be negative.
But I'm talking about what I'm saying might be overwhelmingly negative.
Yeah.
That is, a poll might show,
Yeah.
God knows, 85% of white folks on the street feel like this is some kind of
That's
banditry.
part of the situation,
Now,
isn't
the
it?
thing that is indicative
That's
of the
not new.
problem and the urgency. Not too
Yeah.
long ago, the Gallup folks did a thing around police brutality. And they found out that all except 4% of the black people interviewed, felt that police brutality against minority people was a common occurrence. Less than 40% of the white people interviewed saw that. And what happens is you have, this increasing gap.
Right. Gotta
And
speak
baby, the thing that
communication.
we have to do is not, wait for some miracle to change that gap, but we have to be in there, by we, I mean now particularly people who address, white congregations have to be in there educating and working to
Communicating, yeah.
reverse that trend.
And that's why he heard you saying what I heard you saying and what I'm going to speak to now. This is the crucial point. I remember once in a speech, long story short, this woman said, what I don't like about what you're saying and the position you take is you scare me. And I asked her, to go on into why I scared her. And she said, well, what it boiled down to is a lot of apprehensions about what we might do. I said, lady, let me tell you, we're terrified of you, not because of what you might do, but what you've been doing, for 400 years. And, and what I hear, what I think he was trying to say, he was hearing, what I was hearing was, and when a lot of people hear the same thing, maybe you better check up on what you're saying. When a lot of people hear the same thing, and that is that you're saying, we got to deal with white people, and until white people are together, we can't really deal with this very real problem of black people. What black people are saying is, later, We don't have time for you to wait anymore. We're going to take over the control of our own lives, one way or the other. Now,
Well, you may be hearing what you want to hear too, Father
those of
Woodward,
you
because
who-
that's something that you like
those
to
of
do.
you
You put
who
things
have
in
some
terms of
ability to shape
extremes.
policy, I think this is the challenge of the manifesto, have to begin to address the urgency.
But
of
don't
this
you
priority.
believe that Catholic people are making efforts today in their schools to address this problem?
No.
You don't believe
No,
that?
no
You
white
don't believe-
organizations are. The
You don't-
government, the churches, my church isn't. No.
But, you know,
You don't
we-
believe that
we-
there are Catholic sisters who believe in this and who are trying to say it and try to bring their children up this way? You don't believe that?
No, because
But
we
you
don't have
see-
time.
But
Well,
let
you're
me
not
just point
listening.
out that this thing has been addressed to the white Christian churches and the synagogues. And in whether it's in Christian tradition or the Judaic tradition, we have always had the prophets who have stood up and said, "Thus saith the Lord."
Yes.
And even though I can understand the amount of resistance and the negativism which might be among Catholics, and I don't know whether to say generally or not, but I will say generally, I still
wish we had
think
a
that it
few,
is a responsibility.
Ordinary Presbyterian pastors from
Okay,
somewhere in
yeah,
here talking
yeah,
and also
and, yes, and I certainly shouldn't limit this to
No, of course
Catholics,
you
but I would
shouldn't.
say in the white Christian churches as well. I still think that it is the responsibility of those who follow in the tradition of the prophets to say that this is a just demand, a just confrontation which has come to us, and that the ladies should stand up and make that
Yes.
very clear and hope to God and pray and work.
Well, I think
that others will follow.
Well, not just because it's just,
Yeah.
but because of the potential leadership and therapy in it. That's what I was getting at before. Because it's like for instance, I was at a loss all last year. A lot of criticisms of my talks around the lattice were that I confused people. One of the areas where I confused them was when they said, "What can we do?" I didn't have a legitimate thing to say you could do. Now we have. The reason I didn't was because black people hadn't, as a people, yet said what was legitimate. Now here we find an expression of legitimacy. Now if I speak around the diocese this year and people say, "What can we do?" I say, support the manifesto. There it is, a clear act of self-determination by black people.
But is it clear, Father Woodward? Is it clear to the people who will hear you when you go around talking like that?
Well,
I'm
is
trying
it
to say
clear
that it's
you?
not clear.
Is it clear to you, Phil? That's the question.
It's clear to me if it's put in the terms as was brought up by different people here,
that's
that in the
important.
present situation, yes, we all have this tremendous moral responsibility to react to the terrible situation we live in. I'm just saying that I know my people enough to say, if you put it into the context of the past, they will not hear that.
Well,
They
listen,
don't
you
feel
know,
guilt
all
for what
right,
happened in
Phil.
the past.
You see, I think that you understand why it's put into the context of the past as well as the present, and so that you understand that. I don't know if we're not dealing with a moot question. You see, now after you get to understand it, I would assume that you're able to interpret this to your people so that they will understand
Yeah,
it.
but that's
That
why-
that
yeah.
becomes your real responsibility, not only simply to interpret it to them verbally,
Yeah.
but to begin to act it out yourself so that within the hierarchy of the structure you find yourself in, but you, not only you, but Presbyterians, Episcopalians, and so forth, Methodists, begin to work within the structure they find themselves into.
That is
to
precisely what my
begin
whole effort is.
the leadership, and
Vaughn.
so that it would lead me to the question then, aside from how we're going to relate it to the poor guy in the church who sits at the back and just can't see where he's guilty.
Yeah.
But since we all understand that there is guilt, that there is responsibility,
Yeah.
moreover, since we all understand that, what can or what will the church do? What will you do collectively within your churches to see that the demand for reparations is made real, is fulfilled? What will you do specifically where you are? Aside from just sitting in a kind of discussion with people who
Yeah, I know
agree.
this discussion is a long one.
Well, let me tell you very directly, I will not, absolutely not, connect reparations with the rhetoric of the Black Manifesto. And I cannot, as a Christian pastor, say to people that, well, don't be upset by the words. Don't be bothered by what it says. We don't have to take it seriously. After all, we've sinned in the same way, therefore, we shouldn't worry about their sins. Now, I agree with you. You have plenty of reason. You have plenty of reason to say that there's black people should be afraid of white.
In other words, you don't want to tell your people to do something that you don't believe to be right, right? Do you pay taxes? Do you support the American government's position in Vietnam? Or do you tell your people not to pay taxes and support that slaughter? I do. you know,
Yeah.
because I don't agree with it.
And
You
one
know, I
other
mean, you
point
can
which
be,
I
be
think it'd be
consistent with that
yeah.
very strong
Would-
position.
Can I
you know?
mention that the
Eason,
Cardinal
would you
was
like to
brought
know
up,
what I do do?
the sense of priorities that he did publicly recently. I just wanted to mention that, talk about this question of where our priorities are in America,
Yeah.
Who's
precisely about Vietnam.
Cardinal.
The Cardinal of Philadelphia, our Cardinal of our...
Well, evidently, Betsy slipped. We should have been to the Roman Catholic Church because we don't have an answer from them yet.
But there's one
You
thing I
have to
want to
take
say
care of
about
that.
Frank.
you
Frank,
But when
I think you would say
when you
that
do that,
Holy
think about
Scriptures
Roman Catholic
contain-
mentality and how they think.
I think you would say that Holy Scriptures contain that which is necessary for us to gain salvation. And yet, if you were to accept every approach of the people of Israel and others towards salvation, then you would have to throw out the whole Bible. And certainly there is rhetoric there, and I think you could have hang-ups about some of the things, and I can understand it because you are not in the same position as we. But in the Holy Bible itself, there's also rhetoric, which I don't think you could go along with. And yet, the Bible can lead us to salvation, and this Black Manifesto, as far as we are concerned, can mean salvation for us.
Oh, I think it can. But
And
I
if
think
you
the
to judge it on moral
the
terms.
salvation, but the salvation may not come by taking just the manifesto and going out and saying, that's it.
You,
I think
white
you're
folks
right.
always
You
want to
can't
teach
take
us.
the Bible, you see.
You always
go
want
out
to
and
teach
say,
us
"Take
what we
it."
should know. You know,
for
white
the-
folks
yes.
always want to tell you, that's not enough. You're not asking for enough money. You're not, your wording isn't right. Look, we know what we're doing, and if you think that's the only thing we're going to do, then I'm sorry you have such a shallow opinion of us. What I'm questioning and what you were saying is, and I've heard this so many times, I'm such a moral person. I have such a strong position against violence. Well, let's show it toward Vietnamese people then, if we have a strong position against violence. Why is it only, toward our home front, toward black people here? Dr. King called it split-level morality. We have a lot of split-level morality, and I'm opposed to it too, and I'm glad to hear you say that. I hate to see violence come, but I'm not a pacifist.
And in addition to that, you've got to recognize that just because $5 billion, $3 billion, that will not eradicate the evils in this society, that you don't begin there. That, we're not even talking about whether or not this package is going to take care of all the problems.
No.
It's not going to do away with your guilt. You're still going to owe, but you got to start, and you want to begin starting with some extraneous kinds of things about what you're not going to do. The question is posed as what are you going to do in a positive sense?
But what you're going to do, it makes a difference how you do it as well as what you do.
Frank,
what you're saying is that because I agree that I should do something, that anything that's put in front of me is what I ought to do.
No, what we're saying is, I remember hearing
This is
a Quaker leader say once, we can give you money, but not for use